Rolex will ultimately have their hands in all of their competitors' businesses, such that those businesses won't go and should not go out of business, but will always have the shadow of Rolex over them in a way that allows Rolex to steer the ship of the industry, which is, in my mind, like what is Rolex? What does Rolex want? Rolex wants to be in complete and total control of everything.
This is Openwork, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Riley, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Asher Rapkin, co-founder of Collective. Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California. We carry a wide range of independent brands, including Arcanaut, Ming, Speak Marine, and more. To learn more about us and check out our available inventory, visit collectivehorology.com.
Just a few days ago, on February 7th, 2025, Swiss media outlet Bilanz reported that Rolex is shutting down the Carl F. Bucherer watch brand, which it acquired back in 2023 as part of its purchase of Bucherer, the global watch retailer. The decision to shutter any watch brand, particularly one dating back to 1888, with significant in-house watchmaking resources, is major news. And it's a story with broader implications for the watch industry at large. So, with that in mind, on this special episode of Openwork, we're delving into the details and taking a look at what it all means. I think we can start with just a quick background on Bucherer, the Carl F. Bucherer brand. I learned a ton about its history and significance, which I think is interesting. And we can talk about a little bit of a timeline. But before we do that, Asher, did this news surprise you?
No, not really.
Yeah. It didn't, in light of, I think, our 2025 predictions, which were brand consolidation. It surprised me that it was this brand and it came from Rolex first, but we'll talk about that in a second. And of course, before we talk about any of this further at all, I think it's important to acknowledge that no matter what our thoughts are about whether a decision like this makes sense and the strategy behind it and the intrigue behind it and the implications for the industry, we're talking about people's careers and livelihoods. We don't know for sure what's happened in terms of any kind of layoffs or reorganization. Rolex, of course, is notoriously quiet and doesn't speak on those kinds of things. So we actually don't really know. They haven't even confirmed this story, which I think is important to know. But it's been reported now by a variety of credible watch media outlets. And look, these are people's careers that are being thrown up into the air. There's a ton of uncertainty. People are likely losing their jobs, and that's never something we should take lightly. And we should, of course, recognize that as part of this discussion. That's probably the most important implication of anything that we're going to discuss today.
For sure.
All right. So I actually learned a ton about the Carl F. Bucherer brand in the last few days, doing a little bit of research to prep us for this. Like I said, it's a brand that goes back to 1888. It's inexorably tied to the Bucherer retail business. So Bucherer itself was started by Carl F. Bucherer, and they began by retailing watches and maybe jewelry, but watches certainly in Lucerne, Switzerland. And like a lot of retailers do, over time, they sort of created their own house brand. So, the same way like a retailer like Tiffany has had Tiffany brand watches, Bucherer did as well. Now, oftentimes when, a retailer will start a house brand of any sort, whether we're talking about like a house brand of beer at your supermarket or we're talking about watches, usually they'll use contract manufacturing. So someone will white label make it for them. In this case, I don't know the full history of this, but really it was back in 2001, Jörg Bucherer, who was the descendant of Carl F. Bucherer, who was running the Bucherer business, sort of relaunched, rebooted, and reinvested in the Carl F. Bucherer brand. It had been in operation in one form or another since the beginning, but in 2001, Jörg, as a tribute to what I guess must have been his great-grandfather or something like that, decided to invest and built this brand into a proper manufacturer. So they were doing not only a lot of in-house watchmaking, including movement production, but some really interesting things in form of movement technology, and had some interesting patents on different mechanisms.
Yeah, I think that's what really struck me. you pointed some of these out to me, some of the unique patents they had around flyback chronographs, tourbillons, GMT and world time watches, the peripheral rotor, for example.
Huge one. Yeah, that's kind of the one they're known for.
Yeah, so this was news to me because this was speaking candidly, I'm familiar with the brand as I think so many, collectors knows the industry is. It's like it's an ever-present thing for reasons we'll explain, had incredible real estate relative to a lot of competitive brands that would be bought into a store or a chain like Bucherer. But it wasn't really ever top of mind. Another thing that I think we'll touch on as we look at why this decision was made. But it's important, I think, to look at this as foundational. Like this wasn't a smoke and mirrors brand. This was a manufacturer. And I think it's important to establish that as we think about the context of why this may have happened and where this will take the future of the Bucherer business.
Yeah, and so in particular, it's estimated that really since that 2001 milestone where the brand was kind of reinvigorated, that Bucherer overall invested something like $250 million in the brand and in the manufacturer. Now, I don't know if most of that went to John Wick sponsorships or what. And I don't know that figure has been, again, reported by a number of outlets. It's an estimation. No one knows for sure. Bucherer, I guess, technically still is and was a privately held company. But this was clearly a passion project of Jörg Bucherer. In fact, additional reporting has basically said the brand, which did significant sales volume, I mean, particularly when we think about like independent brand. So they were doing sales recently in the 80 to 100 million Swiss franc mark annually. So this is like $100 million brand. Now, so that's real money. People were buying these watches. Yet apparently the brand, and again, this is all reported. We don't know for sure. The brand never operated profitably. So this is something of a passion project.
An asterisk there, as we often say. We don't know how many people were buying the product. We do know stores were buying the product.
Right. And so in terms of distribution, the primary channel of distribution, but not the only channel of distribution, was through Bucherer itself. And so you can imagine they had probably preferred floor planning and beautiful displays and things like that in all Bucherer outlets. But they were distributed. So I think there are about 100, Bucherer as of now, and this includes Bucherer, which acquired Tourneau, but Bucherer globally has 100 outlets. The Karl F. Bucherer brand has 250 sales outlets. So it's not exclusively sold through Bucherer stores, which is interesting. But of course, even if it were just sold through Bucherer stores, that's 100 outlets globally there. So this is a brand that even if it failed to operate profitably, it did significant sales and it had wide distribution. And John Wick jokes aside, I mean, this was a brand that I think has a good awareness of a good level of awareness, if not familiarity.
For sure.
So it was a significant business. So the other thing to lay out here is just a timeline of what happened in the last couple of years. And I think what we can just do is rewind very quickly to 2023. And in August of 2023, Rolex announced it was acquiring Bucherer, the full business, including the Karl F. Bucherer brand, but really the retail business. And a few important things happened after they did. First, and sadly, just a few months later in November of 2023, Jörg Bucherer, the gentleman who ran the business, the family business, passed away. Apparently, part of the reason he sold to Rolex, according to the press at the time, was he had no direct heirs to pass the business on to or who would run the business. So he sold it to the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation under the understanding, or maybe Rolex, who knows what the business entity is, to sort of preserve and continue the legacy. I don't know where that money went or who benefited from that ultimately, but it was sort of a passing of the torch, and he died just a few months later. Then in 2024, so about 6 months after he passes away in May 2024, it's reported that Bucherer is beginning to expand the floor space they're dedicating to Rolex and to Rolex CPO in particular in a number of their marquee locations.
Makes
so
sense.
Yeah, in Geneva and their flagship and in New York. So they're expanding the presence of Rolex within those stores. And then again, just a few months after that, in September of 2024, so just a few months ago, it was announced that the CEO of Bucherer was leaving the company, and we don't know if he was forced out or retired.
Well, I think he was the
happened.
CEO of Tourneau, who was essentially acquihired through that. Yeah. So again, this is not super unusual in these sorts of circumstances.
No, but I think it was like 2017 or 2018 that Bucherer acquired Tourneau. It's farther back than I recall it being. So he had been in place at Tourneau for Bucherer for 5 or 6 years, which is pretty long tenure for any CEO. And certainly when any CEO departs for whatever reason, new management steps in and things change. Now, what's interesting about new management stepping in is Rolex management stepped in at Bucherer. So back in the summer of 2024, Rolex installed their president at Bucherer. So he became the president not only of Rolex, but also of Bucherer. And the CEO of Rolex, Mr. Dufour, became Bucherer's vice president. So all of a sudden you had kind of the command structure of Rolex now directly running Bucherer. So they were setting the strategy. The Rolex team, in essence, is setting the strategy and running Bucherer, not that sort of legacy Bucherer or Tourneau team. And then we get to the news we just learned, February 2025, the Carl F. Bucherer brand is no longer or is being wound down. And who knows exactly how that will happen. So let's start with that bit about kind of Rolex management taking over. Before we talk about any of the broader implications, what does this say to you about Rolex, their approach to running a business, any business, and the role of kind of Bucherer and retail within the Rolex business?
I think it behooves us to just look at the facts of it and try not to color too much of it, right? Rolex traditionally and famously has not had owned and operated stores and boutiques. And that's been a hallmark of their business for as long as I've paid attention. And that has allowed them to operate as an independent manufacturer where the primary point of contact between the customer and the brand has been through authorized dealers in relationships that are tailored and very heavily controlled by Rolex to ensure consistent experience globally. That's how they tend to think about it. I think it behooves us, in the vacuum of information to look at it and read it for what it is. This is clearly part of the long-term strategy of Rolex to move into having more control over their final point, like the final mile of delivery of their watches. Now, the interesting thing about about doing this through Bucherer, about purchasing Bucherer versus just deciding they're going to do it themselves, because Rolex has vast resources. They didn't need to buy Bucherer. They could just open their own doors. There's no financial need for it. But what this still allows them to do is still have that fig leaf of separation from the customer and the brand, which is really, really valuable for them. Because having that separate space allows them to keep some of the more challenging realities of customer relationships separate from the brand and allow that to be managed by, frankly, people who are experienced in that, which the Bucherer teams almost certainly are, and not get themselves embroiled in day-to-day customer communication, which is a very time-consuming and intense process that the Rolex Corporation is almost certainly not prepared for.
So, for instance, maybe this is what you're getting at, but all of the scuttlebutt about allocation and who's getting access to which pieces, on some hand, it does benefit, we've talked about this, it does benefit Rolex to have that intermediary because, of course, the client can get mad at the retailer and not at Rolex. And so often we hear, like, if Rolex only knew about the way this AD treated me. But of course, Rolex sets all the parameters for those relationships.
But that's a cynical...
But it does protect the brand.
Yeah, it does. But that's the cynical side of it, right? I mean, the other positive side of it is, well, that's because Bucherer is probably very good at it. And if you're, you could go build all your own boutiques and hire all your own staff and scale them all up and train them, et cetera, or you could just go buy Bucherer.
Okay, sure. But what's interesting to me is I went to the Bucherer website just to see what other brands they carry. They have They have everything.
Yes. And that
which is interesting. So it's not just about serving Rolex and doing the best thing to sell Rolex watches. They're also thinking about, I'm just going to read off of you. They're selling Tag Heuer. And obviously it varies by outlet and location and blah, blah, blah. They've got Rado. They've got independents like Hautlands. They have Hermes, IWC, Blancpain. The list could go on. And so the folks who are working at these stores presumably aren't just thinking about what's right for Rolex. Now, of course, I would guess in many cases, Rolex is the straw that stirs the drink. Although interestingly, one of the other things I read in reporting here was Rolex was the number one selling brand by revenue at Bucherer. Karl F. Bucherer was number two. But so that's interesting, but suffice it to say, they have a lot of masters to serve.
Well, I would actually reverse that and say that they are now the master of many others. And I think that is a really critical component to look at when we think about why this acquisition may have happened. As a very good friend of ours once said, look in the direction that money flows. And I have to imagine Bucherer spends hundreds of millions of dollars with LVMH, with Richemont, with all manner of independents all rolled up together. So there's a really interesting sort of pincer move here that's been executed, because now not only did they acquire all of the talent, capability, real estate, et cetera, and so forth about final mile delivery to clients, they also represent not insignificant revenue to all of their competitors or broader competitive set, which allows them to put even more pressure on some of these organizations, right? I mean, like, think about it. In this one purchase, they were able to put pressure now on Swatch Group, Richemont, LVMH, all prior to their divestment, Kering, as well as independents, all at once, while also solving an end user program. It, in many ways, like, it's a screaming deal and an epic power play, because as we know, Rolex doesn't reveal why they're doing something. They rarely even reveal that they are doing something. So now they've got their competitive set sitting around wondering what it is that's going to happen and if that rug is ever going to get pulled from them.
Yeah, it's a good point. Rolex is a very conservative brand in terms of, like, just think about, you pointed this out, the level. Forget about the product and the conservatism around the product. Think about, like, the retail experience at a Rolex authorized dealer. It's so uniformly consistent because they don't like to change much. They try to keep everything uniform and the same and consistent, which has benefits for all sorts of folks. But in order to do that, that means they need to have a great deal of control over their retailers.
Yeah.
You know, like, when they say to do something, the retailer really needs to be incentivized to do it, because that's the only way you get to that level of consistency when you have so many third-party partners. Now, of course, we mentioned Rolex was likely the number one selling brand by revenue at Bucherer before they entered the picture and acquired them. I would imagine that's the case for a lot of retailers who carry Rolex. If it's not the number one brand, hard to imagine what would be, but it's probably critical to their business. A lot of retailers are increasingly opening Rolex dedicated boutiques, in which case, in that point of sale, it's 100% of the business. And so Rolex has a great deal of leverage in that respect. They also have leverage by acquiring another retailer, because it starts to raise the specter for all their third-party retailers. Well, what's going to happen? Are they going to open a Bucherer in my backyard? Are they going to take my franchise away and tell me a new store is opening? And even if they take Rolex away, now there's the threat that Bucherer comes in and opens a store with other brands that they have.
This is my point.
So it just ratchets up the leverage Rolex has, not just over now these other manufacturers, but just their own retailers.
Yeah. And if we spin this around for a second too, and we say, all right, so we see the move here, the potential rationale for this acquisition. You know, it does beg the question, all right, well, if Karl F. Bucherer was, you know, even though it wasn't in the black, was still a $100 million business, why not spin it off into its own thing? And I think that's sort of an interesting rhetorical question to go into. But to do that, you have to look at the Rolex Corporation in general and the brands that are available there. And of course, there are only two brands at Rolex, right? There's Rolex and there's Tudor. I think we've talked about this in the past, and certainly, you know, plenty of other podcasts have talked about the long-term strategy of how Tudor is evolving into what Rolex once was, and how Rolex is going more and more upmarket, and they're creating that space. But it's hard to see where something like a Carl F. Bucherer would fit into that. And without knowing the total, I mean, I know that $100 million is nothing relative to the overall revenue of Rolex as a brand. And I would even go so far as to say that $100 million is well below the watermark for where they want Tudor to be at any moment. So the question really sits there is like, well, what is the, why would I do this? Now, you could say I could sell it.
And by the way, it doesn't necessarily help you with leverage either, because if you're, going to take Carl F. Bucherer away or open a Bucherer point of sale in another dealer's backyard, so what?
Well, then there's the other thing about it too, which is like you can't really sell Carl F. Bucherer because the trademarks, like the actual names, are so similar, Bucherer and CF Bucherer, that if you
that's a point. That's a risk.
Yeah, it's a total risk. So if you spun that out and you sold the CF Bucherer manufacturer, there could be a lot of people out there that could see that as a way to try and counterbalance some form of minor leverage against the larger Bucherer. So you can't do that either.
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking to someone last week before any of this news came out, or there were rumblings of it at the end of the week, and I was mentioning, Carl F. Bucherer, sort of the store brand of Bucherer, and this person was like, "Really? What? I don't think they have anything to do with each other. It's just a coincidence." And we literally had to Google it to show them that Bucherer and Rolex actually do own Carl F. Bucherer. So we may be thinking a little bit too much about this, or a little bit inside baseball, but there's a risk. There's a famous story in terms of trademark, the Carnation packaged foods company, like Carnation canned milk and powdered milk.
Yeah, what is evaporated milk?
It's like powdered milk, essentially. So you just mix it. Dry milk.
Can't you get it in a can?
Well, there's condensed milk as well.
Milk.
Yeah. So in any event, that was huge business back in the day when, having a refrigerator was really expensive and all this stuff.
Was condensed milk shelf stable?
Yes. Yeah. In any event, Carnation was a big packaged foods brand and a big brand. There was also someone who held the Carnation trademark, though, in a separate category, which was fish products. And Carnation, seafood stuff. Carnation, the big Carnation, the dairy brand, actually paid the seafood company to have quality control and food inspectors and things like that in their seafood packaging plants, because of the perception, because of the damage that any kind of recall of the seafood products could have on the other Carnation brand, right? So they apparently tried to buy the seafood company and they refused, and eventually they're like, well, if you're not going to let us buy you,
the shrimps are not available at any price.
We want to make sure, your brand is likewise associated with quality, because if there's a recall, we don't want it to bounce back on our. So what you're actually describing isn't too crazy. I thought that was a funny story from the world of shelf-stable food products.
Well, okay. So then this goes into a sort of a separate thing, right? Which is, all right, so it's $100 million business. It was $100 million business that's underwater. Well, so that, there are a couple ways to look at that, but if we boil it down to its most basic format, it's not making money. But it's still in stores and people are using it. And I'm going to preface this by saying this is rumor and speculation, but I want to put it out there because it's sort of an interesting
rumor and speculation. You're starting here on this podcast, or
rumor and speculation I'm quoting.
Got it.
So I haven't. This is unfounded.
Let's just start a rumor on this podcast.
But the reason I bring it out there is because it does have some potential impact on this, which is that there are clients who report that they were told that certain high demand Rolex models would be made available to them immediately if they also purchased a Carl F. Bucherer watch from Bucherer. Now, a couple of things. Bucherer as a retailer is hardly the only retailer to ever offer a bundle sale, push a bundle sale, or have one. And many retailers have plenty of good rationale for why they bundle. I'm not advocating for that. It's not a thing that we do at Collective, but I completely 100% understand.
Oh, it's a pervasive industry practice.
I totally get why it happens.
But there's a unique incentive in place for them to have bundled Carl F. Bucherer watches versus buy this Vacheron and
exactly.
Sure.
Because if you think about it, right, if we break it down, let's look at Rolex at the time, right? So Rolex's margins are not public, but they are what we know they're going down. So let's assume that they're around 37, 38%, maybe a little bit higher, maybe a little bit lower. That's not a lot. That's not a big margin when you consider the overhead involved in a company like Bucherer. And I'd have to imagine that the net actual take on a Rolex sale is probably somewhere in the range of 7 to 10%.
Well, I think a good proxy for that would be Watches of Switzerland. I think across brands, it was that they reported like a net of 13% or something, which is, that seems high.
But that's assuming good. A 40% margin. So if we assume it's a 36, 37% margin, something in there, they're probably making something in that range, which basically means that on your $10,000 Submariner, the total take on that is like a little bit under $1,000.
Sure, but they're selling them in greater volume. Rolex makes an estimated $1 million of watches. They're easier to sell. They don't sit in the safe as long.
Although that's true, but I'm just saying for context, that's what you're looking at. Now, so let's say you have your $10,000 Submariner gross sale, $1,000 net profit on that after costs, et cetera, right? So that's your actual take for Bucherer. But if I sell you a Karl F. Bucherer where I control the means of production, the quote unquote margin is not calculated in the same way. And a $12,000 or $15,000 Karl F. Bucherer may very well be netting the company 50, 60, or 70% of that overall value.
It all goes down to the same bottom line. And there's also the corporate politics of it, right? So you'd have to imagine internally there was, knowing that this was a passion project of Jörg Bucherer, you have to imagine there was internal pressure from on high to move these watches.
Well, I would go so far as to say it's a $100 million company that was not in the black may not be the right way to measure it, because that division may not have been profitable within Bucherer, but it may have driven significant profits for the Bucherer Corporation as a loss leader. So you see what I'm saying? Here,
how so?
Let me explain.
It didn't seem like again, let's put the watchmaking aside. Yeah. It didn't seem like a particularly desirable product. Wouldn't they be better off selling something else?
What was being sold at Bucherer versus third parties. So you see so like maybe the third party business wasn't super profitable, but maybe the Bucherer part of the business was profitable, because if you're realizing significantly more net profit per sale on a CFB piece that's sold as a bundle against a much lower net revenue product like a Rolex.
I see. Okay.
I'm getting great point. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, like, on paper, it kind of looks like this isn't so great. In practice, this may have turned what would have been a $1,000 net sale into a $10,000 net sale for Bucherer in that one day. So
has anyone ever tried to bundle you on a Karl F. Bucherer watch?
No, but there have been plenty of people who have tried to bundle me in the past.
Yeah.
And it didn't go well.
So, I mean, have you been ever bundled at like a large chain retailer a la Tourneau, Bucherer, watches, like any of those kinds of they've attempted to bundle?
Yes.
It's usually pretty clear what they're trying to bundle you towards. Like most people are asking for things like a Rolex, AP, Patek. Like, what are the things that are generally on the table for bundles? What are they pushing?
I don't want to go too far off topic on this, but I think the thing that's interesting about a bundle is that to me, it's like caveman sales. And the reason why I say that is, let's think about how people generally think about a quote unquote grail, like a white dial Daytona. Okay. They think about that as like a piece that you work towards. What does that mean? That means that you have a spend history. Now, every company may have a metric inside of themselves, like inside the walls of their company, that say, all right, in order for Gabe Riley to qualify for a Daytona, he has to spend, I'll make it up, $100,000 of gross, purchases, ideally split across these product categories in a set period of time to qualify for a Daytona. And why do we qualify for Daytonas? Because they, as a company, do not receive many, and the demand far exceeds the supply. So they have to choose who they're going to give it to. And most companies make that decision based on the revenue value of a client. This is not any different than the majority of businesses out there that tend to put their biggest spenders.
That's how I got my Ferrari. Yeah, it's a joke.
Ferrari?
No, but this is what allocations happen 100%. In the car business as well.
The problem with bundling is like that sales component, like that's just sales, right? Just thinking about that strategy as part of sales strategy. The caveman part of it is that instead of having any nuance or subtlety, you're coming right out and you're just bashing the guy with your cave club. Buy more to have it now. Or even in some cases that I've seen or experienced myself, I've had someone bluntly tell me, you haven't met your spend threshold to get this watch yet. And of course, that doesn't make anybody feel good.
But yeah, sure. And there's all sorts of ways to put it. I was talking to another reformed retail sales associate who sold a number of very desirable brands. And he was telling me, he didn't bundle himself, but he was telling me he'd seen all sorts of softer white glove approaches taken, like read between the lines. Oh, well, the customers for whom pieces like this are available are people who do X, Y, and Z. So therefore read between the lines.
Okay,
so
so
there's
now it's a little bit more of a polished like club for the caveman, but it's still
it's the the silk hammer, the velvet hammer. But I guess like, have you noticed like, are there things that they're generally incentivized to try to bundle you on?
Things that have bigger margins. I mean, that's what that's what we're trying to get to here.
So
right?
that's why sometimes I don't know. I'm genuinely asking this. Does jewelry have better margins? Because I often hear people are bundled on jewelry.
Depends on the jewelry. I mean, diamonds in particular are not necessarily not necessarily high margin product, but the setting that they're put in might be. So it really depends on that. And by the way, side note, we should have a jeweler, like an actual, like serious jeweler to talk about that side of the business, because neither you nor I are equipped to do that. But before we get too far off topic.
Okay, but the point is on margin, and then speaking of incentives, that absolutely underscores the Carl F. Bucherer thing. It's like all of them, the company, if they made and sold the watch, they were capturing essentially all of the margin.
Well, sure. Yeah. And when you think about it in that context, it explains the logic of like why a CFB would have been sold with a Daytona, a Sub, a GMT Master, like what have you. Now, I think about this too, and I go back to some of the earlier thoughts we had around divestment and just the consolidation of brands moving forward. It makes me wonder as we look at, and we think about that podcast we talked about a few months ago with on Standard H with Tim Mosso around this idea of duplicative brands that operate in the same holding company, for example. And like, is this even something that the market has enough hunger for? And, to me, like, this is an interesting little bit of a warning sign to some of those brands. These are brands that compete in the same vein or the same class of product within a holding company.
Oh, you're saying that you think in this particular product, a brand segment, whatever you'd put Carl F. Bucherer in, you think there's some softness in there in general?
Well, yeah. Now, I don't. Now, realistically speaking, I don't know that Richemont and LVMH and all of these bigger holding and Swatch Group are sophisticated marketers enough to know cross-brand purchase to determine if there is enough duplicative overlap. And by the way, I don't mean that as like a dig on those companies. The reason I say that I don't think there's
cross-brand overlap would be great. Wouldn't you be stoked to find out like someone who's a Panerai collector is buying IWC and is also into Vacheron?
Well, would you though? Because in that particular price class, there may not be people who are buying as heavily and aggressively as there are in other price classes. And I don't know. I'm just to go back to the core point that I'm making, and I want to be clear here. Like I'm not actually taking a cheap shot at holding companies with that. The reason why there often are not that kind of cross-brand data is because that's considered so proprietary to each brand that sharing that can, even though you could understand why somebody at a Richemont level or an LVMH level would see a lot of value in it. If you're the president of JLC or you're the president of Longa, like that may or may not really help you.
Well,
because then you get into this like conquesting cycle.
You're selling primarily through third-party retailers as well. Now, there are some exceptions in there, like Longa, for instance, but like
Vacheron.
Yeah, but most of the holding companies are doing their business through retailers, and the retailers aren't sharing that data.
No,
nor can they.
But you know who is sharing that data within their own walls? Bucherer.
Yeah.
So another advantage here is that these guys, like the Rolex folks, may have come in and done an analysis.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and they may have just looked across the price class and like, what are we doing with this brand, like that is quote unquote underwater? Because we're not going to bundle people. Like the Rolex Corporation doesn't believe in this. Let's assume that's true. Like the Rolex Corporation doesn't believe in this. We're not going to do that. This brand is underwater. Over here, we have this other competitive, some of these complications are competing and price classed with JLC. Maybe JLC, we get excellent margins on. So we buy just like, we buy these by the metric ton. And maybe we want to focus more on that. Maybe our relationship with this brand is more successful. And why do I have this distraction over here? Like, what is it doing for me?
But you're right. I didn't even think about it. Part of me is like, well, what doesn't Rolex just now want to force out every brand from its store that's
Absolutely
not Bucherer? But
not.
Think about all the information and insight they're getting into what sells. Yeah, that's fascinating.
And to me, like this is both the power and the terror of industry consolidation, because when you start seeing more and more power coming into a retailer like this, owned by a brand with essentially what is essentially unmoored financial resources, like unbelievable financial resources, and the data of decades of sales. Not only do they see sales trajectories, but they know individual client book reality, and they can choose how they want to move a client through that. And then they can choose like what's a distraction in their store and what isn't.
Yeah. Well, I think it one of the things it does say about Rolex and their approach to business is, you're right, they have all the resources in the world, right? And they decided to close this thing down. It shows a level of discipline and focus. And it's like part of the reason they're as successful and as flush as they are is because of discipline and focus.
Well, the other side of this too is...
Because it would have been a rounding error just to let it continue.
Well, correct. But there's another way to look at it, which is to say, in this case, the component or the composite elements of that brand do have value to Rolex, just not in the way they did to Bucherer. Bucherer saw this as, and again, this is, I'm looking on the outside in, but Bucherer probably saw this as a way to increase revenue per ticket, right? Forget about the passion of it and all of that. I'm just talking pure lizard brain business. If I add a
I think the passion of it goes a long way to explaining a ton here, and everything else is a rationalization.
No, it absolutely does. But
there's also value within the brand and the business.
Yeah, and when you add that and you add it to a ticket, and it significantly increases the net revenue of that ticket, that's meaningful. But
there's also value in the facilities, in the watchmakers, and the staff.
That's what I'm getting at.
Probably some of the intellectual property and patents and things like that.
If you decide that the per ticket net revenue bump doesn't matter to you, and you look at what does matter to you, that's what you probably see as Rolex. There's a watchmaker shortage. I got a building full of super talented, highly capable watchmakers here. Why on earth would I lay them off?
Yeah, and the number that's reported in terms of people who work at the Karl F. Bucherer brand is 100. I would argue, based on revenue and things like that, most of those people aren't watchmakers, but a significant number
Even if
are.
Half of those people
probably
are skilled, trained watchmakers.
But they're skilled and trained in all manner of the watch industry, and Rolex is a growing business.
That's 50 people that they can just acqui-hire, and I hope they do, because that would be not only great for those people to make sure that they have a place to go and that they weren't laid off and that they're not looking for work, but it makes perfect sense. Why would Rolex let go of that? Not to mention, we don't know what other kinds of equipment are in that facility. When we look at some of the new product that Rolex is releasing, some of those have engine turn dials. If there's engine turning machines in there and people who know how to do them, maybe that's a skill that can be brought in house. These are all things that if you break the company apart, to your point, whether it's institutional knowledge, skill set, or patents, like the value is there.
You're right. And it's like Rolex is so valuable. Their intellectual property is valuable. Their resources, their watchmaking, their talent, their products are so valuable. Why would you put people against anything else? It actually reminds me a lot of the logic, when we worked at Facebook, they would sort of experiment with like new teams and products all the time. Like, we're going to go over here and try to build this app or do this. And sometimes there were things that would just get killed. And by the way, I'm not endorsing or apologizing for any of Facebook's business or management practices, but this is a similar mindset. There were things that seemed to be successful and doing well in terms of like new products that were developed, that were catching on or had promise, that would just get killed. And, would come up, and the company would do these like weekly question and answer sessions with Mark Zuckerberg, which I thought was interesting. At the time, it was pretty transparent, and he would answer any employee question. And people would say, why did you kill this app? It was growing at a particular rate, or this product showed promise, or whatever. And the argument at the time was, across everything we do and the amount of people that our apps and services serve and provide, and the things that really drive the value of this company, not just the revenue of the company, but like the products that provide utility to humanity at scale. Why would I have 100 people over here working on this thing that's niche and experimental and may have some value, when I have a major app or service over here, whether it was Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp, that we can't hire enough engineers for and need people on? It's a tough decision I need to make in a world of scarce resources. So do you think some of these resources go toward the 1908 collection, or
who knows? Because that presumes I know like where the areas of
speculate. You have the right to speculate here.
I think Rolex is above all a deeply pragmatic company, and they put one foot in front of the other, and that's how they operate. So I think, while there are surprises, quote unquote, that come from them, what is a surprise from Rolex is pretty modest from another company. And
Fair
that's
enough.
not, that's not like, that's
why
not
would
rip,
I make another 1908 when I could be making a beautiful gem set Daytona?
Well, yes, but I think what I'm trying to get at is they don't do anything without a long-term plan. So 1908, they didn't launch it to put out 2 watches. You know what I mean? Like
Okay.
they launched it to launch a line. And there's, I'm sure, a long-term, multi-decade strategy for why they did that, who they view the client is for that, and how they're going to grow it. And I'm sure they're thinking about a resourcing plan to make that plausible. We know that they've been building more facilities for watchmaking. We know that they're trying to figure out how to scale. We know they're very dynamic in how they think about their inventory. Like, they're a very deliberate, thoughtful company that does its absolute best to be non-reactive. And the pandemic is the perfect example of this.
You think Rolex is selling more 1908s in terms of revenue than the Karl F. Bucherer brand?
I doubt it.
You think they're doing $100 million in revenue?
I doubt it. Only from a
those
volume
watches
standpoint.
Okay.
We're hearing most retailers get one of those a year. So, like, I don't know how that's like plausible. 1 or 2 of those a year.
Yeah.
But my point is, could the 1908 line become a platform for complicated Rolex moving forward? The Sky Dweller and chronographs notwithstanding, yeah, maybe. But could but in a near term reality, do these assets of actual human talent and whatever physical assets may have existed at CFB provide near term value? Almost certainly. So when I look at this news, it's something that I think is indicative. If it is indicative of anything, it is indicative of Rolex being deeply methodical in their approach to how they're going to continue to tighten that noose around the rest of the industry, 1 micron at a time, until everyone that they're competing with is under their control. And I think this is the important thing that I see. I don't think it's in Rolex's interest to choke out the rest of the industry. That's bad. Because if you're going to be the best, you got to be the best compared to something else. So you can't do that. But what you can try to do is get everybody to step into the trap and build that wall around them. And so that 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, people have a brick wall built around them. And they didn't even see it getting built until.
What do you mean by that? What's the brick wall that's being built around them?
Is the fact that Bucherer, and in order for this to work, Bucherer has to continue to be a dominant player in this industry. But if Bucherer continues to be purchasing money that cannot be made elsewhere, so in other words, if the account, if the LVMH account, if the Richemont account at Bucherer represents so much money that if that money went away, those businesses would lose a leg of the chair, that means that Rolex now has control over them.
Yeah, and this is a even less fortunate example, but we hear within the industry all the time of brands who are unwilling to walk away from particular retailers for exactly that reason. And they may know that the retailers in that case are doing damage to their brand one way or another, but they can't walk away from.
Sure, but in this instance,
can't
I'm not
walk
saying
away from the wholesale
damage to the brand. I'm just saying they're going to have to do business the way that they're told to
on their terms. Yeah. No, but my point is we see that now already, which is we see even large holding companies in positions with particular retailers where they feel like they don't have a choice because the revenue is significant. Can I give you my conspiracy theory?
Yeah.
Well, it's not really a conspiracy theory, but look, without any glee, we predicted that this would be a year of brand consolidation. This would be a year where brands were shut down or spun off. And I think, you were more in the camp of like, well, I think we'll see spin-offs because that's generally what happens like in the fashion industry. Most brands, like a holding company, figures they need to move on from them. They spin them off. They don't outright shut them down. But do you think this is like the Elon Musk moment for other brands? In other words, do you think Rolex, with all of its resources, with all of its leadership in the industry and all of its perceived strength, having shut down a brand, that the other major companies will be more open to the idea because, look, no one takes this lightly, but I would guess that, and this is a guess, but part of the reluctance for a large company, whether it's a Richemont or an LVMH or whomever, Swatch Group, to shut down a brand is a perception that it creates for the larger company, which is they didn't manage it well, or what were they doing this whole time with it, or didn't they have a plan, or wasn't there something they could do to save it? Does it help now? Does it give them permission? Well, if Rolex is doing it, they're a leader. They're in a position of strength. Look, they're shutting down brands. So now we have some permission to do it ourselves that we didn't have before.
If you're going to think like that, then you presuppose that you're in a position like Rolex is. And you're instantly hamstrung by that. Because, as I said earlier, I strongly believe that nothing Rolex does is not part of a multi-year, like Rolex here.
That's not my point. My point is, if someone's in a boardroom at Richemont debating whether or not, and I'm making this up, holding company X debating whether they should shut down a brand, there's probably someone who's like, well, if we do that, we're going to look weak, and people are going to ask, why we didn't do this sooner, or didn't we have a plan?
I think if somebody wants a pretense to make a move like that, all they need to do is find some stupid Business Insider article, and like that. But
my point is, don't you think someone in that meeting room is going to go, well, guys, Rolex did it, so now this is our opportunity I'm because we won't look weak.
Okay, all right. So yes, do I think people will use this as an excuse? Sure, but I think that is a fool's errand. Because,
but I've seen this happen in other industries. This happened in the technology industry. Elon Musk lays off half of Twitter. Then guess what? Now it's okay to go around laying people off. In fact, it's cool. And I'm not saying I believe that, but it sort of started this meme.
Yeah. And without stepping in that whole situation.
No, and it's horrible. And of course,
I think your question of, do I think this will give people permission to make decisions that may axe brands? Potentially. But I think if you evaluate it in that way, you might be making the wrong choice. I'm not saying that it wouldn't be a bad idea to eliminate some duplicative brands, perhaps. That may be a rational thing. If the reason you're doing it, or you think the permission structure is that, well, Rolex did it, so I should, then you might be missing the point about why we think Rolex may have done it.
Okay, that's a good point. Fair enough.
So I think that's the catch, where when I look at something like this, from a pure business standpoint, I have not seen Rolex blink or make a problem for themselves because they are so deliberate and they think on such a long time. Because you think about it, like if you think about business on a quarterly basis, it's always going to be a rush. Right? 12 weeks is just not a long time. And if you're constantly doing check-ins, like if you're listening to this, think about, like, if you have quarterly performance reviews, how infuriating is that? Because it's like, what could you have accomplished since the last review? It's ridiculous.
Well, you wrote your self-review and your peer feedback and the reviews for your team. So
right. So my point is, if you say for a second, like, let's get out of the corporate kabuki of that, and instead let's look at what a business could look like on a 5, 10, 20, 30, 50-year horizon, then quarters are one step. They're not the bum rush. There's not the goal. It's a step.
Sure.
So that's what I'm saying. Rolex and the benefit of that, by the way, is that if you make a misstep, it's just one step. You can fix it on the 50-year horizon. It's not ruinous. But if you think about everything as 12 weeks in a quarter, 4 of those a year, where are we with the whatever, situation, and, give me that report, you're constantly chasing your tail.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that Rolex does better than anybody else, partially because they're so well capitalized, and partially because they've made an institutional decision to operate that way.
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to the timeline we spoke about at the beginning of the show. Like, the breadcrumbs for this decision unfolded literally over years.
This is my point.
And so, like, this is not something that happened within a quarter because someone wasn't hitting a number and right. They were looking for a pretext to close down a brand. This was step by step by step by step to get here. And you see it all now, and it's like, oh, okay, well, maybe when Mr. Dufour joined the management team of Bucherer, that was a sign. Maybe So all of that stuff sort of fits together. But you're right. The decision that would likely be made inside holding company X would happen within a quarter.
Yeah.
And you're right. It certainly gives permission, but it's a different kind of decision altogether.
Yeah. So I think we should end this on the sort of more to me, like what is the most fascinating rhetorical question of all of this, which is I have a couple ideas of where I think Rolex is going in 50 years.
Well, can I ask you another question? I'd like to hear that, but like counterfactual. Part of me wonders, and again, this may be because when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. One of my favorite Charlie Mungerisms. But look, we predicted this is going to be a year for industry consolidation. If the watch market weren't what it is today, and we rewind the clock, and everything we just described happened years ago, and it's now instead this is February of 2021 or 2022. You think Rolex is making the same decision?
100%.
Okay. So that's the difference, right? It's like Rolex would make the same decision for all the reasons we described. The other corporations likely wouldn't.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting counterfactual. Here's another one. Was there another move here? Was there a world in which Rolex keeps the Karl F. Bucherer brand and it makes sense? You gotta use some imagination here. I'm torn on this one.
So, in order for that to make sense, if we want to play with that hypothetical, what
would that look like?
Well, the Karl F. Bucherer brand would have to be a brand with enough equity in it, and I mean like brand equity in it to actually feel like you wanted to invest in it. And I think the thing that we're all struggling with here, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there was a very attractive Karl F. Bucherer world timer with Hodinkee about a year ago.
Very cool, very cool watch. Beautiful. That is one of the most referenced watches in this news cycle as an example of the good stuff that the brand was capable of.
Why did that watch have a hard time selling? Because it said Karl F. Bucherer on it.
Yeah.
And I think this is that's the fundamental, because what went through the heads of potential buyers? Oh, that's really beautiful. Oof, man, I'm gonna have a really hard time selling that. Or like, boy, that feels really expensive.
Or I don't know why I should care about Karl F. Bucherer.
So you would have to decide as a company that you were not just going to invigorate a brand, you were essentially going to build it from the ground up.
And in this case, the horse is already out of the stable. If
you're Rolex, why?
Yeah.
Like, why? What will it do for you versus what we just described?
With 1908, you have a product line in which you've started from scratch where you can build the right
watchmakers.
Yeah. All right. Fair enough. I couldn't sleep last night, and this was one of the things I was like, all right, try to think about this a little bit laterally. And the thing I came back to is, there's a world where, the product offering of Karl F. Bucherer and its own brand could have made sense. The problem is there was decades of equity before Rolex ever stepped, and baggage before Rolex ever stepped into the picture.
Yeah.
And the highest use of your resources isn't fixing that. I mean this in the best possible way. Rolex are brand snobs. And that's a compliment, right?
Absolutely.
Like one of the companies I worked for in my advertising career who was the snobbiest about brands, but who I really admired was Coca-Cola, the Coca-Cola company. They really understood the value of a brand and what it meant to build a brand and manage a brand. They institutionalized it as a practice. I mean, I've never seen, they understood all the psychology behind it. They trained their workforce on it. Like they understood and walked the talk on the value of a brand, unlike any other business I've ever seen. Rolex is similar in that regard.
Who is the quote? You have a wonderful quote about this. A brand is a promise that's made to a customer. Who was that attributed to?
Oh, I don't know. I just make that up. Either I stole that from someone, or I made it up. Yeah, there's my favorite one actually, which I stole from the former U.S. CEO of Audi. He was also the CEO of, after the diesel scandal of Volkswagen of America. Is imagine a cocktail party and a new guest walks through the door and everyone looks at that person. The judgments they make, the things they think about that person are their brand. So in other words, like a brand is your kind of costume you wear in the world. And it tells everyone about you. Do I want to talk to you? Do I think you're interesting? Are you for me or not? Do I think you're funny? Do I think you're someone who looks kind? Do I want to talk to you? All those sorts of things. Like, I always try to imagine that. It's like, yeah. And I think the problem is Carl F. Bucherer had already entered the room.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, you've answered your question about why
they were already mingling at the cocktail party. to put it that way.
Or if we really like extend this metaphor, if Carl F. Bucherer is Rolex's date, what is that doing for Rolex?
Yeah. All right. We've beaten this down. All right. So now you've got a grand theory about the next 50 years of Rolex. I would love to hear this.
I said it earlier. Yeah. It's just this idea that by exerting control very slowly over both retail channels, having lateral information about their competitive set, and owning significantly more of their final mile delivery, Rolex will ultimately have their hands in all of their competitors' businesses, such that those businesses won't go and should not go out of business, but will always have the shadow of Rolex over them in a way that allows Rolex to steer the ship of the industry, which is, in my mind, like, what is Rolex? What does Rolex want? Rolex wants to be in complete and total control of everything.
Man, I thought I had a good conspiracy theory with my Elon Musk thing. That takes the cake. Should we leave it there?
Let's leave it there.
Well, thanks for listening. This is Openwork, a production of Collective Horology. You can find us online at collectivehorology.com. And to get in touch with suggestions, feedback, or questions, we love those. Just email podcast@collectivehorology.com.